My subject of this lecture, Moses Hess, was born in 1812 in the city of Bonn. He was the son of the first generation of Jews to be, so to speak, liberated from the ghetto by the occupation of the Rhineland by the French. The French occupied the Rhineland in 1795 and left it in 1815. And in that period, the gates of the ghetto were flung open, and the Jews at last were admitted to the light of day. When the Prussian monarchy annexed the Rhineland after the defeat of Napoleon, it sought and succeeded in reimposing some of their old restrictions. This naturally created a terrible crisis among the Jews of that particular district. They had only been admitted a very short time before to the rights and to the enjoyments of a larger life of the Western world. And now they were once more to be pressed back into the darkness from which they had been freed so shortly before. The crisis took them in very different ways. Some of them could not tolerate the thought of returning to the old oppression, and some of them accepted baptism with varying degrees of sincerity. People like Werner, people like Karl Marx's father, people like Heine, the very brilliant Hegelian lawyer Edward Ganz, Ludwig Stahl, who then later founded the Christian Socialist Party in Germany, all accepted baptism. On some Jews, however, it had the opposite effect. On the contrary, they clung with all the more pride and all the more tenacity to the faith of their fathers. And among these was the family of the Hesses, who had originally come from Poland. Nobody quite seems to know quite what date. Moritz Hess, as he was called at birth, was brought up in Bonn. His father moved in 1817 to Cologne, where he started a business as a sugar refiner, in which he became very prosperous. And the boy was brought up by his grandfather, who was a pious old businessman in the city of Bonn, who left a very profound impression on the boy indeed. That's quite clear. He used to read the Bible with him, he used to read the Talmud with him, and in his later memoirs, Moses Hess tells us how this good old man, who used to read these classics with him in the evening, used to shed salt tears when he spoke about the exile of the Jews from Palestine, how he used to describe to him, how he used to read to him passages in the prophet Jeremiah about Rachel weeping in her grave as Ramah over the Jews being driven off to the Babylonish captivity, and that kind of thing. And there's no doubt that throughout Hess's life, the images and the memories of the Bible and of Jewish history in general remained in a very indelible manner. Throughout his writings, even his most socialist, most communist writings, these things recur. And it is in virtue of that his more irreligious associates, such as Marx and Engels, used in after years to refer to him contemptuously as Rabbi Moses or Rabbi Hess. In the 20s, the family, he moved to Cologne to his father, and in 1830, he went to the University of Bonn. We know nothing about his life there. There is no record of his having ever matriculated even. All we know is that after a year or two there, he displayed extreme signs of impatience and began to be rather tiresome to his father. That is to say, he refused to go into the family business. He began reading books. He retracted to the then widespread social movements which were sweeping over France and had begun to touch Germany. He imported various books from France and began to convert himself towards some kind of shadowy socialism. In the end, as many young men do under those conditions, particularly the emancipated sons of prosperous but somewhat respectable fathers, he quarreled with his parents and left his native town and wandered off with very little money indeed to Holland, Switzerland, Belgium, Paris. We find him in Paris in the 1830s living on very small sums of money, and there avidly consuming the whole of that vast socialist and communist literature which at that time was being pouring from the French presses. So far as one could tell, he converted himself to some species of idealistic communism. It wasn't what we later think of as Marxism at all. It was some kind of, at that period anyhow, the disciples of Saint-Simon and Fourier and the like were preaching what in general is a combination of a planned economy and social egalitarianism. Moses Hess, who at all times of his life was an extremely idealistic, good-hearted, not very clever, kindly, sympathetic, if effervescent young man, absorbed these doctrines like a sponge. And by the time he wandered back to Germany, he was fully converted to the socialist or communist. There was no difference in those days between these words. Socialist or communist doctrines which maintained that the possession of private property was the root of all evil, that men would never shake off the miseries and the injustices in which they lived until the power of wealth was broken and until some kind of collective or social life, as he called it, was created on earth. He came back to Germany in the middle 30s and began to preach this doctrine fervently to his German friends. He lived his first book, which was printed in 37, which was called The Sacred History of Mankind, is the kind of book which every young German intellectual of that period felt it necessary to write. It's an amalgam of Hegelian philosophy, a certain number of verses from the Bible, a good deal of metaphysical interpretation of history. I won't go through it for you. It's very, very inferior work, which Hess's biographers pay some attention to, but which is unread in its day. It sells no copies, as far as one can tell, and was justly forgotten. The main importance of it for us is that already then he maintained that the important task before modern mankind was the creation of a united humanity governed by the emancipated spirit of man, not as materialistic as the French wanted it, not as idealistic as the German metaphysical philosophers wanted it, but some kind of rather shadowy, frightfully confused, rather muddled solidarity of human beings bound together by common sense of justice and affection. There's really not much more in it than that. He described himself at that period as a disciple of Spinoza, while his biographers piously say he was deeply influenced by Spinoza. I think if you look at his works, there is no trace of any influence of the great 17th century master. He was a popular figure among the German romantics in the period. I dare say Hess gained from him some notion of the unity of nature, God, mankind, something of the kind. But beyond rather trite monism of this sort, Spinoza doesn't really seem to have had much influence on him. But I think he was rather proud and pleased that Spinoza was a Jew, and therefore desired to be influenced by him, was pleased to think that he was a disciple, although I'm afraid he didn't take the trouble of reading his works very carefully, or if he did, his writings betrayed no influence of such learning. Shortly after this, towards the end of the 30s, Hess became a journalist in the Rhineland and began to collaborate in various radical publications, which again was a normal enough thing for a young man of that time. His second book, published in 1841, was called The European Triarchy, which was published in answer to a book called The European Pentarchy. Again, we needn't stop very long over that. It was simply a scheme for the purpose of resisting Russia, which was then regarded as a reservoir of the most violent black reaction by the three great and noble powers of Europe, France, Germany, England. Germany had emancipated the spirit of man, France had emancipated the social life of man, and England was responsible for political and economic liberty. These three nations must then come together and work in common for the greater good of mankind. At this point, he suddenly begins to mention the Jews, to whom there are only very cursory references in the early work. He takes a line which is approximately that of most socialists and indeed Protestant theologians of the time. He says the Jews have played out their part. They were once a very important nation. Indeed, the Mosaic law and the ancient kingdom of the Jews was exactly what Hegel would have had it to be, a close union of church, religion, state, and social life. Of that he approved. But the Jews had played their part by paving the way to Christianity, and now they were obsolete and must go. He didn't indulge in the anti-Semitic philippics of Karl Marx, who had a temperament very different from Hess's. Karl Marx, as everyone knows who has read his early work, simply took the line of wanting to eliminate any possibility of being insulted as a Jew in later life, and therefore simply decided to liquidate the whole problem. What Karl Marx did was to say, there is no such nationality, no such religion, no such race as the Jews. They are simply moneylenders, the product of capitalist vice, and when the communist revolution occurs, the Jews, simply a symptom of the general malaise of the world, will automatically evaporate. This was an authentic line, exactly the same line as was taken by the most rabid anti-Semites throughout the 19th century, of whom Karl Marx could certainly be counted as an important leader.